Hello and welcome back to another evening together. Tonight we're doing something I've wanted to do for a while. We're going to talk about Dexter, not the plot, not a season ranking, not an argument about which villain was better. Though for the record, Trinity, always Trinity. No, tonight we're going to talk about the questions, specifically the questions that Dexter plants, very deliberately, very carefully, and then just leaves sitting there, unaddressed, unanswered, sometimes for a season, sometimes forever. The threads the show pulls on and then quietly sets down as if hoping nobody noticed. I want to call them conspiracies because that word has the right flavor. Not the tinfoil hat kind, not the writers were secretly signaling something or this hidden clue changes everything. More in the sense of things the show sets in motion that when you sit with them long enough, point toward conclusions the narrative never quite got around to confirming. Accusations it makes without a verdict. Implications it floats and lets drift. Because Dexter is, at its core, a show built on a single, unresolved question. Is Dexter Morgan fundamentally a monster, or is he a person? And every season, in one way or another, the show approaches an answer and then backs away. That central ambiguity is a feature, not a bug. But around it, orbiting it, there are dozens of smaller, unanswered questions. Questions about Harry, about Brian, about the code, about the people who got close to the truth and what happened to them, about what the show was actually saying underneath everything it was explicitly showing. Those are the questions we'll be spending this evening with. Now, before we get into any of it, I want to say the thing I always want to say before these kinds of videos. This isn't a takedown. I don't do takedowns of things I love, and I love Dexter. Deeply, slightly embarrassingly. I've watched this show more times than I have any right to admit, and I still think seasons 1 through 4 stand with the best television ever made. So when I say, the show never bothered to deny this, I'm not saying the writers were careless or that the show failed. I'm saying that the best version of Dexter is a show smart enough to know which questions to leave open, because the open questions are part of what makes it linger. So if you're comfortable, if you got somewhere warm to settle in, then let's begin. We'll take these slowly, there's no rush tonight, and if you're new here, welcome. I do these long-form companion videos about shows I find endlessly rewatchable. The kind of content that's hopefully interesting enough to keep your brain company while you drift off, but calm enough not to actually keep you up. If that sounds like your kind of thing, there's a subscribe button down below. But for now, let's talk about Dexter Morgan. Let's talk about his father, his brother, his code, and all the things the show spent 8 seasons almost saying. One thing I want to note before we start properly, I've tried to choose questions the show specifically set up and then didn't answer, rather than just criticizing things that are wrong. There's a meaningful difference between a plot hole, something that doesn't make sense and was never meant to not make sense, and an open question, which is something the show built, explored, and then chose to leave unresolved. The conspiracies we're looking at tonight are almost all in the second category. They're not accidents. They're architecture. The show is smarter than it sometimes gets credit for, and a lot of what I find most interesting about Dexter is precisely the stuff it deliberately refused to tidy up. There's also a version of all of this that isn't conspiratorial at all, and I think it's worth acknowledging. A lot of what I'd describe as questions the show never answered are really just the natural result of writing a long-running serialized drama about morally complicated people. Characters like Harry and Matthews and Vogel aren't designed to be fully transparent. Real people aren't fully transparent. The ambiguity around them isn't evasion. It might just be honesty about how much we can ever know of another person's motivations, even the ones we love. But knowing all of that doesn't make the questions less interesting to sit with. If anything, it makes them more so. The fact that the show's ambiguities feel like they belong to real people rather than to narrative convenience is a measure of how well it was written, at least in its best seasons. Dexter's the kind of show that rewards sustained attention, and sustained attention is what we'll be giving it tonight. So, get settled, we've got plenty of ground to cover, and none of it is going anywhere quickly. One more thing before we properly start, which is a note about the specific kind of attention these videos invite. I find that the best way to watch Dexter, or to revisit it, or to think about it on a quiet evening like this one, is with the kind of relaxed, unfocused attention that lets connections form on their own. The questions we'll be discussing tonight aren't the kind that reward frantic cross-referencing. They're the kind that reward sitting with, turning over slowly, letting settle. The show built them that way. They emerge gradually rather than demanding immediate unpacking. So if something I mentioned connects to something you remember from a specific episode, or contradicts something you'd always assumed about a character, or just sits a bit awkwardly in your understanding of the story, that's exactly the right response. That slight friction is the show doing its job. It plants these things specifically so that they don't quite resolve, so that something keeps working in the back of your mind long after the episode ends. These conspiracies have been working on Dexter's audience for almost 20 years now. There's no rush to finish with them tonight. Let me start at the very beginning, not with Dexter himself, but with the man who made him. Harry Morgan is presented throughout the original series as the moral backbone of everything. He's Dexter's adoptive father, a decorated Miami police officer, the man who recognized something dangerous in a traumatized child and chose to shape it rather than suppress it. The code of Harry: only kill murderers who've escaped justice, never get caught, protect the innocent, is framed as an act of profound love. A father doing the only thing he could think of to keep his broken son from becoming something uncontrollable. That's the story the show tells in the first few seasons, and it's a genuinely moving story. Michael C. Hall's interactions with the hallucinated version of Harry are some of the best scenes in the series. There's real warmth there, real grief. The relationship between Dexter and his imagined version of his father is the emotional engine of the whole show. And yet, the more you look at Harry Morgan, the real Harry Morgan, the one the show gradually reveals over 8 seasons, the harder it becomes to see him as simply a loving father doing his best. Because the full picture of Harry is considerably darker than the version Dexter carries around in his head. Here's the thing the show reveals in season 2 and then never quite fully reckons with. Laura Moser, Dexter's biological mother, was Harry's confidential informant. She was also, as Dexter eventually learns, Harry's lover. They were having an affair. Laura was working for Harry, feeding him information on a drug operation, and it was that relationship with Harry that put her in the shipping container in the first place. The men who murdered her did so because she was an informant, Harry's informant. Dexter and his brother Brian sat in 2 inches of their mother's blood for 2 days because of Harry Morgan's choices. The show drops this information in season 2 and treats it as a significant revelation. Dexter is genuinely shaken and starts to question Harry's motives about the adoption itself. Was Harry's decision to take Dexter in an act of love, or was it guilt? Was he trying to save a child, or trying to make right something he'd broken? The show raises this question directly and then, rather than answering it, moves on to the next crisis. And then there's Harry's death, which is a separate conspiracy of its own. For most of the series, we're told Harry died of heart disease. He was a cop who worked too hard, a man worn out by the job. Dexter carries this as a clean piece of history, uncomplicated grief. And then, in season 2, Captain Matthews reveals the truth. Harry didn't die of natural causes. He overdosed on his heart medication. He killed himself. The reason, Matthews says, was that the number of criminals benefiting from a flawed justice system had simply become too much for Harry to bear. The world was unjust, the system was broken, and Harry couldn't live with it. This is the official explanation, and Dexter accepts it at first, but then there's the flashback. 3 days before Harry's death, he walks in on Dexter in the middle of disposing of a body, not catching him in the act of a kill. He knew about the kills, he'd sanctioned them, the code was his idea. He walks in on his son cheerfully, almost joyfully dismembering a corpse. And Harry's reaction is not the reaction of a man who knew what he was sanctioning. He vomits. He backs away. He tells Dexter in exactly the same words Doakes will later use in the cabin, "Stay away." And 3 days later, he's dead. Dexter puts this together himself. Harry couldn't live with what he had created. Not the abstract idea of it, not the philosophical framework of the code, the actual physical reality of what his son had become. He built the monster, watched it work, and it destroyed him. Now think about what that means for the story the show has been telling. If Harry killed himself because he couldn't bear what he'd made Dexter into, then the code wasn't a gift. It was an experiment that got away from him. He thought he was building a contained, directed thing. A scalpel, maybe, pointed at guilty people. What he actually built was something that loved what it did, something that was happy, something that cheerfully tidied away a human body and looked up expecting praise. Season 8 adds another layer to this with the introduction of Dr. Evelyn Vogel, a neuropsychiatrist who reveals that she helped Harry design the code. Harry didn't invent it alone. He consulted a professional, a woman who specialized in high-functioning psychopathy, who had written academic papers on what she called the true psychopaths, people without conventional empathy who operated seamlessly within society. Harry came to her with a problem, a traumatized child with homicidal urges, and together they built a system. That changes the texture of everything. The code isn't a father's desperate improvisation. It's a clinical framework, co-designed by a professional who was, at some level, treating Dexter as a research subject. Harry brought in a specialist. He didn't just love his way through a crisis, he commissioned a solution, which raises the question, whose interests was the code primarily serving? The official answer is Dexter's. The code protects him, channels him, keeps him from unraveling. But look at what the code actually does from a practical standpoint. It keeps Dexter functional. It keeps him employed, socially coherent, relationally connected. It keeps him from doing anything that would draw attention to himself or, by extension, to Harry. A code that said, only kill people who genuinely deserve it and never get caught, is also, conveniently, a code that protects Harry's legacy, protects the Morgan family name, and prevents the discovery that a decorated Miami detective spent years knowingly enabling a serial killer. I'm not saying that was Harry's primary motivation. I genuinely don't think the show is saying that. But the show plants enough detail to make the less flattering reading available, and then doesn't bother to close it off. What we're left with is a Harry Morgan who had an affair that contributed to the death of the woman he was sleeping with, adopted her son out of a combination of love and guilt, designed a system for managing that son's homicidal tendencies with the help of a neuropsychiatrist, and then, upon finally witnessing what that system had produced, chose death over living with the reality of it. That's not a heroic story, it's a tragedy. But it's also, if you read it slightly sideways, something close to a villain's arc. A man who set something terrible in motion, convinced himself it was righteous, and then couldn't face what he'd done. The hallucinated Harry that Dexter carries around is, by the show's own framing, not really Harry. He's a construct. He's Dexter's internalized voice of the code. When this imagined Harry says wise things, makes difficult points, challenges Dexter to be better, that's Dexter arguing with himself, using his father's face. The real Harry died 3 days after saying, "Stay away." What Dexter imagines he would say is a comfort, a story, not necessarily the truth. The show, to its credit, knows this. It never fully lets Dexter off the hook for having built a father out of his memories rather than the actual man. But it also never quite delivers the verdict on what the actual man deserved. It leaves Harry in that ambiguous middle space, beloved, complicated, possibly culpable. The conspiracy the show plants is that the gentlest, most devastating reading of Dexter's origin is one where the person most responsible for what Dexter became was also the person Dexter loved most. And the show never bothered to deny it. There's another layer to Harry that I find worth sitting with, and it's the domestic one. Doris Morgan, Harry's wife, Dexter, and Deborah's adoptive mother, is largely a ghost in the narrative. She's referenced but rarely explored. She was ill for much of Dexter's childhood, and she died when he was still relatively young. Harry is always positioned as the decisive parent, the shaper, the architect of what Dexter became. But Doris knew about Dexter's dark side too. There are moments in the series where this is implied, that she understood Harry was managing something in the boy even if she didn't know the full shape of it. What did Doris Morgan make of her husband's project? What did she think was happening with this adopted child that Harry spent so much private time with, coaching and training and disciplining in ways that were never quite explained? The show doesn't ask this. It positions Doris as a background figure, mourned briefly and then set aside. I don't raise this to suggest anything troubling about the Morgan household. I raise it because the absence of Doris's perspective, her understanding or misunderstanding of what Harry was doing, is another piece of the picture that the show chose not to fill in. Harry's choices existed in a domestic context. They had a wife in them. And the show, which is genuinely good at showing us the private consequences of secrets, never quite bothered to show us what Doris saw or thought or suspected. Then there's the question of what Harry's ghost actually means for Dexter's psychological health across the series. The imagined Harry functions as a conscience. He challenges Dexter, pushes back on decisions, occasionally appears to confirm when Dexter has done something right. He is functionally the part of Dexter that wants to believe in the code, given a face and a voice. But the hallucinated Harry evolves. In the early seasons, he's fairly clear-cut, supportive, guiding, the voice of the framework. By the later seasons, he's considerably more complicated. He contradicts himself. He's uncertain. In season 8, when Vogel's existence rewrites the origin of the code, the imagined Harry has to accommodate information that the real Harry never processed. This is a slightly strange situation when you think about it. Dexter's having internal dialogues with a construct based on a man who is dead, and the construct is being updated in real time as new information about the real man emerges. The Harry in Dexter's head is a character that Dexter keeps rewriting. He is less a memory than an ongoing creative act. What this means for the Harry conspiracy is that the show essentially acknowledges through this device that Dexter's relationship with his father is with a version of Harry that Dexter controls, the real Harry, with his affair, his guilt, his commissioned neuropsychiatrist, his final act of overdosing on his heart medication. That Harry is inaccessible. What Dexter has instead is an idealized, modifiable figure who can be made to say whatever the current version of Dexter needs to hear. That is not a relationship with a father. It's a relationship with a story about a father. And the conspiracy, if you want to call it that, is that the story has always been more comfortable than the truth would have been. Now there's an interesting wrinkle that the franchise added with Dexter, Original Sin, the prequel series set in 1991 Miami, following a young Dexter in his first year as a forensics intern and the early kills that preceded the version of him we meet in the original series. Original Sin gives us Harry in a different register. Not the hallucinated wisdom figure, but an active, present character making decisions in real time, navigating his relationship with his son's emerging violence, trying to manage what he's created without yet fully understanding it. What Original Sin does, deliberately or otherwise, is make Harry more human and therefore more fallible than the idealized ghost the original series preserves. You watch him make mistakes, you watch him hesitate when clarity would have served better. You watch him try to be a good father to something he recognizes is beyond ordinary fatherhood, and you watch the effort cost him. He's not the wise, steady, tragic figure of Dexter's memory. He's a tired man doing his best with a situation that has no good options. I find Original Sin interesting precisely for what it adds to the Harry conspiracy, the accumulation of small human errors that preceded the larger tragedy. Harry didn't set out to build a monster. He set out to manage a crisis. The monster emerged from a series of individually defensible choices that, in aggregate, produced something he never intended. That's not absolution, it's context. And context is exactly what the original series mostly withheld, keeping Harry as an almost mythological figure rather than a complicated person. The two versions of Harry together, the ghost in the original series, the living man in Original Sin, give you a more complete and more troubling picture than either alone. The original series needed Harry to be partially noble because it needed the code to carry emotional weight. Original Sin can afford to be more honest because the audience already knows how the story ends. The result across both is a character whose full shape is genuinely dark, even if no single season ever shows you the whole thing at once. That fragmentation is itself part of what I'd call the Harry conspiracy. The show divides the evidence across seasons and series in a way that makes the uncomfortable conclusions available to anyone willing to assemble the pieces, while never forcing the assembly on the audience. You can watch the original series and see Harry as a loving, tragic father who made one terrible mistake. You can also, if you're paying attention to everything the franchise has added over the years, see something considerably more complicated. The show never insists on either reading, it just builds them both and lets you choose. Since we're on the subject of Harry's choices and their consequences, there's a thread connected to everything we've just talked about that I think deserves its own space. Brian Moser, the ice truck killer, the season 1 big bad, the elegant, bloodless, taunting presence who carved up victims and drained them white and left them posed in public places like art installations. A serial killer with a specific signature and a specific obsession. His obsession being Dexter himself, who he'd been trying to contact for years before the season started. By the time the ice truck killer reveal lands at the end of season 1, you've been watching Brian as a villain for 12 episodes. He's cold, unsettling, and genuinely threatening. When it turns out he's Dexter's biological brother, it's one of the better season-ending revelations in the show's run. And then Dexter, faced with a choice between his blood relation and his adoptive sister Deborah, who Brian has wrapped in plastic and is prepared to kill, chooses Deborah. He slits Brian's throat and stages it as a suicide. The ice truck killer dies. The story ends. Except the story doesn't end because if you keep pulling on the thread, you end up somewhere genuinely uncomfortable. Let me back up to the shipping container because everything starts there. Laura Moser is murdered. Her 2 young sons, Dexter, who is roughly 3 years old, and Brian, who is several years older, are both present. Both sit in her blood. Both are traumatized in a way that the show implies is profound and formative. Both are left there for 2 days before anyone finds them. Harry arrives. Harry sees 2 boys in their mother's blood. Harry takes Dexter. He doesn't take Brian. The show doesn't dwell on this. It passes by it fairly quickly. Brian was already several years older, perhaps deemed too difficult to integrate into a family, perhaps too far gone psychologically. The show offers only vague justifications, most of them implied rather than stated. Harry took the one he could save, or the one he felt most responsible for, or the one he could manage. Brian went into the system. He was institutionalized for antisocial personality disorder. He was released at 21, having been apparently cleared for reintegration into society, and he became the ice truck killer. Here's something the show mentions but doesn't examine very carefully. Brian's time in the institution. He was committed as a child, diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and released at 21, having been cleared for reintegration. That's roughly a decade or more in institutional care, starting from a trauma age and extending through adolescence into early adulthood. Think about what that means developmentally. Whatever capacity Brian had for normal emotional connection, and given that he demonstrably had enough to spend years trying to reach his brother, he clearly had some. That capacity developed in an institutional environment, without a family, without continuity of care, without the kind of anchoring relationship that Harry gave Dexter and that the show implies was central to Dexter's ability to function at all. Brian was forming his understanding of the world, of relationships, of himself, entirely within a system that categorized him as a disorder rather than a person. The institution didn't make Brian the ice truck killer. His choices made him that. But the institution shaped the person who made those choices in a context that was about as far from the Morgan household as it's possible to get. Dexter had Harry, he had Deborah, he had a home, a school, a dog, a set of relationships that gave his life texture and continuity even as Harry was quietly building the code around him. Brian had none of that. He had professionals and schedules and therapeutic frameworks and eventually a certificate saying he was sufficiently rehabilitated to go back into a world he'd never really been part of. The show presents Brian's villainy as evidence of what Dexter might have become. But it never asks what Brian's villainy is evidence of about the systems that were supposed to help him. That's a question the show couldn't quite ask without changing what it was about. So it doesn't ask. It presents the result. The ice truck killer, the season 1 villain, and lets the cause remain quietly visible in the margins for anyone looking closely enough. The thing that made Dexter into a functional serial killer rather than a chaotic one was Harry. Specifically, it was Harry's intervention, the code, the structure, the framework, the sense of purpose and identity that channeled Dexter's darkness into something directed. Without Harry, the show strongly implies Dexter would have become something like Brian. With Harry, he became something more like a scalpel than a bomb. The variable between Dexter and Brian is Harry, which means Harry didn't just fail to save Brian. He is, in a structural sense, the reason Brian became what he became. By choosing Dexter and leaving Brian, he guaranteed that Brian would have no code, no direction, no framework for what was clearly a parallel psychological inheritance. He left Brian to develop on his own, in an institution with no guidance and no love and no father to shape him into something survivable. Both boys had the same trauma. Both boys had the same beginning. The difference in what they became was the presence or absence of a man who chose one and not the other. Brian knew this. That's what makes his season 1 arc so quietly devastating when you rewatch it with this in mind. He wasn't primarily trying to terrorize Miami. He was trying to reach his brother. The ice truck killer's crimes were, in their bizarre way, an attempt at contact. The bloodless victims, the carefully posed scenes. Brian knew Dexter was a blood spatter analyst. He was leaving messages in the only language he thought Dexter might understand. He spent years trying to find the brother who had been taken without him. And when they finally meet, what does Brian want? To be together, to have the family he had been denied, to have his brother. He tries to kill Deborah not out of pure malice, but because Deborah represents the life that replaced him. She's the sister Dexter got instead of his biological family. Brian's violence is, in its warped way, a form of sibling jealousy. It's dreadful and unforgivable, but it's also recognizable. The show dispatches him at the end of season 1 and never quite gives him his due. He reappears in Dexter's mind occasionally, a memory, a ghost, but always as a villain rather than as a victim of the same system that shaped Dexter himself. I've always thought the most honest read of Brian Moser is that he is what Dexter would have been without Harry. Not a comforting thought, not a forgiving one either. Brian made his choices and murdered real people. And there is no excusing that. But the question of why he became what he became and who bears responsibility for leaving him without any alternative is one the show raises clearly and then lets pass. Harry chose Dexter. That choice had a cost. The show never makes Harry pay it because Harry was already dead and because the story needed a villain for season 1. But the cost was real, and it was named, and it was Brian Moser. There's something else worth noting here. Dexter kills Brian in the season 1 finale. He stages it as a suicide. And the show treats this as a moment of clarity. Dexter choosing his constructed family over his blood family, choosing the code over connection. It's presented as growth, or at least as decision, but there's a darker reading available which the show doesn't deny. By killing Brian, Dexter eliminates the only other person alive who knew his full origin. The only person who shared his memory of the shipping container. The only living link to the life he had before Harry. And the only person who could, theoretically, have told anyone what Dexter really was. Whether the show means that reading or not, it's sitting there in the text, undeniable once you've seen it. One more thing about Brian that the show glosses over and that I find quietly significant. When Brian is eventually revealed and Dexter confronts him, Brian says something that doesn't get the attention it deserves. He tells Dexter that their mother's name was Laura. He gives Dexter information about their origin that Dexter didn't have and hadn't been given by Harry or anyone else. Brian is at that moment not just a villain monologuing. He's the only living person who shares Dexter's actual history. He knows details that no one else alive knows. He's giving Dexter the thing that Dexter has been circling around for years, the truth of where he came from. And Dexter kills him for it, stages it as a suicide, and then spends the rest of the series reconstructing that history through other means. Through Camilla, through records, through whatever fragments other people can provide. Because the one person who actually remembered it is gone. There's something genuinely tragic in the structure of that. Dexter kills the only witness to his own origin. Whatever grief and confusion Brian carried with him about Laura, Moser dies with him. Dexter's access to his own history is permanently narrowed at the moment he executes his brother, and the show frames this as a consequence of Dexter's attachment to Deborah, to his chosen family over his blood family, without quite reckoning with what it cost him informationally as well as emotionally. Brian is the conspiracy the show plants and buries simultaneously. He's introduced as a villain, disposed of as a villain, and then referenced occasionally as a memory, always as the ice truck killer, rarely as the boy in the container. The show chose the narrative convenience of a seasonal villain over the deeper, slower, much darker story of what Harry's choice actually produced. And that choice, once you've seen it, is impossible to unsee on rewatch. The ice truck killer was real. He did terrible things. But Brian Moser, the boy Harry left behind, that's the figure worth grieving, even as you understand why the show couldn't quite make space for it. One last thing about Brian, and then I'll let him rest. The show's treatment of him in the seasons after his death is telling. He appears in Dexter's hallucinations occasionally, not with the consistency of Harry, but in specific moments of psychological pressure. When Dexter's thinking about identity, about what he is, about where he came from, Brian surfaces. He's never fully expelled. He's the shadow that Harry's carefully constructed story casts. There's a scene in season 7 where Dexter, under enormous pressure from LaGuerta's investigation and his increasingly destabilized relationship with Deborah, briefly thinks about Brian, not with grief exactly, more with something like recognition. Here's another version of himself. Here's what he might have been. The scene doesn't dwell on it. The show never dwells on Brian. But it's there. And what I find interesting about those moments is that the show is acknowledging quietly that Brian never really went away, that killing him didn't resolve the question he represented. The question, what does Dexter owe to the family he was separated from, to the identity he was taken from, to the person he might have been without Harry's intervention, outlives Brian himself. It's still in the show in season 7, 8 years after the season 1 finale. It's part of the DNA. The franchise has never, across any of its iterations, revisited Brian Moser properly. Original Sin, which covers the period before the original series, doesn't go far enough back to show us Brian as a child. New Blood and Resurrection are set too far forward. Brian exists in that gap, and the period of the original series, the container, the institution, the years of becoming. Without anyone to tell his story, he is perhaps the show's most complete, unfinished piece of business. Not the most consequential, not the most dramatic, but the one that, if you follow the logic of everything the show sets up, feels most like something left deliberately undone rather than accidentally omitted. The show knew what Brian's story implied. It just chose very carefully not to follow it all the way down. Now let's talk about one of the most interesting pieces of deliberate ambiguity in the whole series. And I do mean deliberate. This one, I think, the writers knew exactly what they were doing. The dark passenger. If you've watched Dexter, you know the phrase. It's Dexter's name for the internal compulsion that drives his need to kill. Not a voice, not a hallucination, more like a pressure, a presence that exists behind everything else. When Dexter goes too long without a kill, the passenger builds. When he acts on it, he feels relief. It's the constant hum underneath his life, the thing the code was designed to manage. The origin of the term is actually addressed in the show, and the answer is quietly interesting. In a later season conversation between Dexter and the hallucinated Harry, Dexter says he assumed Harry came up with the phrase. Harry says, "I gave you the code. The dark passenger was all yours." Dexter invented that name himself somewhere around the age of 12, and Harry let it stand because he didn't know how else to help a boy that young understand feelings that complicated. So Dexter named it himself. He built a mythology around his own psychology before he was old enough to properly understand either. The Jeff Lindsay novels, the books the show was based on, treat the dark passenger as something genuinely supernatural. It's implied to be a kind of demonic possession, an external entity that latched onto Dexter in the container and never let go. The books lean into the metaphysical. Dexter is not entirely responsible because Dexter is, in some sense, occupied. The television series explicitly rejected this. The show's Dexter is grounded in psychological realism. There is no supernatural element. The dark passenger is framed as the result of trauma, wiring, circumstance. An internal condition, not an external one. But here's the thing. By making it psychological rather than supernatural, the show actually made the question harder, not easier. Because if the dark passenger is a demon or an entity or something that attached itself to Dexter from outside, then Dexter isn't fully responsible. He's a host. He's carrying something that isn't his fault. But if the dark passenger is just Dexter, if it's his own psychology, his own desires, his own violence, given a name and a mythology and a separate identity to avoid the full weight of ownership, then who is responsible? The show makes Dexter address this directly in one of the better scenes of the later seasons. The hallucinated Harry says, "Maybe the dark passenger's just a feeling." And Dexter resists. He pushes back hard. His exact words, more or less, are, "If there's no dark passenger, then I'm responsible for everything I've done." He doesn't want the dark passenger to be just a feeling, not because he's certain it's real, but because if it isn't, the moral accounting becomes unbearable. That's a remarkably honest piece of character writing. Dexter's telling us that the dark passenger concept serves a function for him. It externalizes the thing he's afraid to own. It lets him be a person who is driven to kill by something beyond his control rather than a person who simply wants to kill and chooses to. The distinction matters enormously to him, even if it may not matter at all to the people on the receiving end. And the show, this is the genuinely clever bit, never resolves it. It presents both readings simultaneously and doesn't tell you which one is true. Is the dark passenger a genuine psychological entity with its own shape and momentum? Or is it a story Dexter tells himself to maintain a self-image he can live with? The show builds arguments for both positions and then leaves you in the middle. What I find most interesting about this is how the dark passenger functions within the broader mythology of the show. Dexter uses it to explain why he's different from ordinary killers. The ones he hunts, he has a dark passenger. They're just choosing to be monsters. His is inherited, inflicted, not truly chosen. But the show keeps undermining that distinction. Dexter develops genuine emotional connections. He loves Deborah, he loves Harrison. He grieves Rita in a way that doesn't look like the performance of grief. It looks like actual grief. By the later seasons, the gap between what a psychopath is and what Dexter actually is has become hard to locate, which means either Dexter isn't a psychopath, the dark passenger is something other than pure cold compulsion, and there's more agency and feeling in him than the mythology allows. Or the show has been slowly, across 8 seasons, building a character arc where Dexter is growing into the capacity for genuine human experience, and the dark passenger is gradually becoming less true of him, not more. The show gestures at both of these and never commits. The dark passenger is real enough to structure the narrative and vague enough to never have to be accounted for. It remains the show's most carefully maintained piece of productive ambiguity. What it never does is tell you it's just an excuse, but it never tells you it isn't either. And the show notably never bothered to deny that the most honest psychological reading of the dark passenger concept is that it is, at least in part, a story a traumatized person told himself so that he could live inside his own head without going mad. There's a dimension of the dark passenger that I think is worth spending a moment on, which is what it does for Dexter's social mask. Dexter's public persona is carefully constructed. The cheerful forensic nerd, the devoted family man, the affable colleague who brings donuts and makes jokes about blood. This mask is deliberate and it's exhausting. Dexter says so repeatedly in his internal monologue. He fakes almost everything. The connections feel artificial to him. The social rituals are a performance. The dark passenger gives him an internal explanation for why this is. It tells him, you feel separate from other people because you are separate. You are different in a fundamental way. Your psychology is not the same as theirs, and the gap you feel is real. Not a failure of empathy or effort, but a genuine ontological condition. The dark passenger is the story that makes the exhausting performance of normality make sense. Without it, Dexter might have to confront the possibility that he's simply a person who has never learned how to connect, which is a far more ordinary and far less narratively satisfying explanation. One of the more interesting things the show does in the later seasons is gradually undermine the dark passenger's explanatory power by showing Dexter developing genuine connections that the mythology shouldn't allow for. His grief after Rita's death reads as real. His protectiveness of Harrison reads as real. His love for Deborah, whatever form it takes, reads as real. By season 7, you're watching a character who is supposed to be operating primarily under the control of a compulsive internal entity, but who also very obviously loves people and is capable of being devastated by their loss. Either the dark passenger has always been less than Dexter thought it was, or Dexter is more than the dark passenger mythology allows for, probably both, but the show refuses to formally dissolve the concept. It remains structurally necessary even as the character outgrows it. That tension between the mythology Dexter was given and the person he gradually, inconsistently became is one of the more quietly fascinating things about watching the show from start to finish. The dark passenger is the show's most carefully maintained ambiguity. It does too much narrative and psychological work to be discarded, and it's too honest about its own uncertainty to be confirmed. It just stays there, named and present and unexplained, which is probably the most accurate thing the show ever did. There's also a question the show raises through the dark passenger that doesn't get examined nearly enough, which is what it means for Dexter's relationships. Specifically, can someone with a dark passenger, a genuine, persistent compulsion that shapes their identity and drives their behavior, be in a real relationship with another person? Or are all of Dexter's connections, however warm they appear, performed on top of something fundamental that can never be shared? The show gives different answers at different points. Early Dexter is quite clear that his emotional connections are largely simulated. He watches other people, learns the patterns, replicates the responses. He's performing husband, performing colleague, performing brother. The dark passenger is the real thing underneath, and everything else is surface. But then Rita's death breaks him in ways the show doesn't reduce to performance. His grief reads as genuine. His relationship with Deborah, especially across seasons 6 and 7, involves real emotional risk on his part. He tells her the truth, he lets her into his world, he is genuinely afraid of losing her. These aren't performances, these are connections, so either the dark passenger mythology was never quite as totalizing as Dexter believed, and there was always more genuine capacity for connection in him than the framework allowed. Or the capacity developed over time, and Dexter became something different across the run of the series, something that didn't fit the original architecture. Either reading is available, both are interesting, and the show characteristically builds evidence for both without resolving which is true. The dark passenger conspiracy, at its most distilled, is this. The show uses the concept to ask whether someone who was shaped into a killer can also be a person who loves people and is loved in return. The answer it arrives at over 8 seasons seems to be yes, imperfectly, conditionally, at great cost to everyone around him. But the question of whether the two things can really coexist, whether the dark passenger and the genuine connections are compatible or fundamentally in tension, is one the show never quite resolves. It lets them coexist without explaining how, which might, in the end, be the most realistic answer available. There's one more angle on the dark passenger that I find worth mentioning briefly, which is how differently the concept functions across the show's run in practical terms. In the early seasons, the dark passenger is presented as something urgent. It builds pressure. When Dexter doesn't kill for a while, the show conveys a kind of mounting internal friction, a sense that he's running out of road. It functions almost like an addiction model. The compulsion intensifies without satisfaction, and the risk of uncontrolled expression increases. But by the middle and later seasons, the dark passenger has become something more diffuse. Less a pressure that builds and more a permanent background condition. Dexter doesn't seem to go through acute withdrawal periods the way he did in season 1 and 2. The dark passenger is still invoked as a concept, still referenced in the internal monologue, but its urgency has diminished, which might reflect character development. Dexter becoming more integrated, the compulsion becoming more manageable. But it also just reflects the show needing to tell different kinds of stories without always returning to the kill pressure mechanic. What this means for the dark passenger conspiracy is that the concept's internal consistency changes across the run of the series. The thing it describes in season 1 and the thing it describes in season 7 are not quite the same phenomenon, even though they share a name. The show never addresses this directly. The dark passenger is treated as stable even as its narrative function evolves. That's not necessarily a flaw. It might reflect something true about how psychological conditions change over long periods, becoming more integrated and less acute. But it's one more place where the show plants the concept and trusts the audience not to push on it too hard. I want to talk about Tom Matthews for a bit, because I think Captain Matthews is one of those characters who, if you actually track what he knows and when he knows it across the run of the series, becomes considerably more interesting and considerably more troubling than the show ever quite lets him be. Matthews is presented as a supporting character, senior brass, career administrator, Harry Morgan's old friend, the man who smoothed things over when they needed smoothing and applied pressure when pressure was useful. Gruff, politically savvy, not particularly warm but not malicious. He shows up in scenes, delivers exposition, occasionally protects Dexter from institutional scrutiny, and exits. But let's inventory what Tom Matthews actually knew. First, he knew Harry committed suicide. The official record said heart disease. The actual record, which Matthews had buried, said overdose on cardiac medication. He knew this. He suppressed it to protect Dexter and Deborah, and he sat on that information for years. He didn't just know about the suicide, he actively participated in the institutional cover-up of it. Second, he knew about Brian Moser being Dexter's biological brother. This comes up in season 7 when LaGuerta's investigation is gathering steam. Matthews tells LaGuerta about Brian and what's framed as new information for her. But it's old information for him. He already knew. He knew both boys had been in that container. He knew Harry had adopted one and left the other to the system. He had known this for years without ever mentioning it to Dexter directly. Think about what that means. Matthews knew that Brian Moser, the ice truck killer, a man who murdered multiple people and nearly killed Deborah Morgan, was Dexter's biological brother. He knew that Dexter grew up without knowing he had a living sibling. He knew Harry had made a choice that left one boy in an institution and took the other home. He knew all of this, and he said nothing. Third, his behavior during LaGuerta's season 7 to 8 investigation. LaGuerta is quietly, methodically building a case that Dexter Morgan is the Bay Harbor butcher. She's doing good police work, she has evidence, she has reasoning. And Matthews is, without ever quite saying it, steering her away from the conclusion. He's skeptical of her theory at every turn. He dismisses the bloodslide. He protects Dexter in conversations. He frames her concerns as personal bias rather than legitimate investigation. Now, the charitable reading of Matthews here is that he genuinely doesn't believe Dexter is the butcher. He knew Dexter as a child. He trusted Harry's judgment. He's applying a prior belief rather than following the evidence. But the less charitable reading, and the show supports this reading too without committing to it, is that Matthews is not skeptical because he's uninformed. He's skeptical because some part of him has always known or strongly suspected and has been quietly protecting the Morgan legacy for years. Here's the thing about Tom Matthews that the show never quite addresses. He is a career detective. He knew Harry, he knew Dexter from childhood. He knew Harry had been so disturbed by something Dexter related that he took his own life. He knew Brian Moser was Dexter's brother and that both boys shared a trauma origin. He knew the Bay Harbor butcher was operating in Miami. He had, at minimum, the same dots LaGuerta was connecting. He just had them years earlier. Did Matthews look at those dots and choose not to connect them? Or did he connect them and choose to look the other way? The show leaves this beautifully unresolved. Matthews is never explicitly revealed as complicit, but he's also never exonerated in any meaningful way. He occupies the position of the man who knew enough to know, if he'd been willing to know, and whose willingness to protect the Morgan family ends up serving Dexter very effectively without ever quite putting Matthews himself in legal or moral jeopardy. There's a small, easily missed exchange in Season 7 where Dexter directly confronts Matthews about LaGuerta's investigation. Matthews gives Dexter a warning, a heads up that LaGuerta is building a case. He doesn't have to do that, he chooses to. And when Dexter looks at him in that scene, there's a beat, brief, not dwelt on, where it seems like both men understand that more is being communicated than the words are carrying. The show plants this and moves past it. It never gives Matthews a scene where someone asks him directly, "How much did you know? What did you protect, and why?" He exits the narrative, having never been held accountable for whatever it is he did or didn't know. The show plants this and moves past it. It never gives Matthews a scene where someone asks him directly, "How much did you know? What did you protect, and why?" He exits the narrative, having never been held accountable for whatever it is he did or didn't know. That's the Matthews conspiracy in a nutshell. A man who, by virtue of position, history, and intelligence, almost certainly had more information about Dexter Morgan's double life than he ever acknowledged, and who used that information, or the discretion around it, to quietly ensure that a man he'd watched grow up from childhood was never caught. Not through active assistance, just through the strategic application of not looking. Comfortable that, but not nothing. There's a concept in legal theory called willful blindness, the deliberate choice not to know something that you could know in order to preserve plausible deniability. It's used in cases where someone clearly had access to information suggesting wrongdoing, but made a point of not pursuing it. Courts treat willful blindness as roughly equivalent to actual knowledge, on the basis that choosing not to know something you had every opportunity to discover is itself a kind of knowing. Matthews is a textbook case of willful blindness. He had the connections, the history, the investigative background, and the specific knowledge to piece together what Dexter was probably years before LaGuerta got close to it. The question of whether he chose not to look or looked and chose to stay quiet or genuinely failed to connect the dots is one the show positions as unresolvable. Deliberately, I think. Because if Matthews knew and protected Dexter, then he's complicit in every murder Dexter committed after the point of knowing. That's a staggering moral weight for a character the show uses largely as a bureaucratic foil. The show can't quite take Matthews to that place without it becoming the main event. So it keeps him in the middle, watchful, quiet, possibly guilty, definitively unexplained. What I find most interesting about Matthews across the full run of the series is that he represents the institutional face of what Dexter's existence requires. The code works not just because Dexter is careful, but because the system he operates within is staffed by people who, for a variety of reasons, decline to see what is directly in front of them. Matthews is the highest-ranking expression of that. He is, in his studied and curiosity, the most powerful protector Dexter never had to ask for. The Matthews conspiracy points towards something slightly larger than one character's willful blindness, which is the question of how institutions protect their own. Harry was a celebrated, well-connected officer. Dexter was raised in that world and entered it professionally. His social network is built almost entirely from people whose professional identities are tied to law enforcement. These are people who, when confronted with evidence that one of their own is something terrible, face an enormous institutional pressure to doubt the evidence rather than the person. This isn't unique to Dexter, it's a pattern that real institutional systems exhibit. The tendency to protect members against external scrutiny, to attribute accusations to personal grudges, to frame the accuser rather than examine the accused. What the show does with this is dramatize it through the Doakes and LaGuerta arc specifically. The two characters who most clearly break from institutional loyalty to follow the evidence are the two who are destroyed by it. The institution doesn't deliberately protect Dexter, it just naturally operates in ways that produce his protection as a side effect. Matthews is the clearest embodiment of this because he's near the top of the institutional pyramid and because his relationship with Harry predates Dexter entirely. He protects Dexter the way people protect things they associate with someone they respected. He's not doing it for Dexter exactly, he's doing it for Harry, for the legacy, for the version of events where Harry Morgan was a great cop and a good man, which requires a version of events where Dexter is not a serial killer. The conspiracy the show never names but consistently demonstrates is that Miami Metro, for all its bumbling and its procedural comedy and its rotating cast of detectives who can't quite connect the dots, is actually quite effective at the thing institutions are most reliably effective at, which is protecting their own image. Every failure to catch Dexter is simultaneously a success at maintaining the fiction that Miami Metro is not the department that employed and funded and gave database access to a serial killer for 20-something years. Nobody in the building benefits from that truth coming out. And so, quietly, systemically, without anyone having to make an explicit decision, it doesn't. There's a small character connected to the Matthews conspiracy who deserves a mention, and that's Camilla Figg. Camilla was Harry Morgan's longtime friend at Miami Metro, the archivist, the keeper of records, a woman who clearly knew Harry well and cared about what he'd built. When Dexter, in Season 1, begins digging into his own past and eventually confronts her with what he's learned about the shipping container massacre, Camilla reveals that she destroyed his adoption file the day the paperwork went through. To protect him, she says, and because of what Harry saw in that container. Camilla knew, she knew about Laura Moser, about the massacre, about the circumstances of Dexter's adoption. She destroyed official records to obscure the connection. She did this decades before LaGuerta found the bloodslide or Doakes started following Dexter with a GPS tracker. She was, in a sense, the original member of the informal protection network around Dexter's secret. When she dies in Season 3 of cancer in a genuinely moving series of scenes where Dexter sits with her through her final days, the last of that original network is gone. Harry is dead. Matthews is living with his silence. Camilla, the third member of that founding group of people who knew and said nothing, dies without being asked directly what she knew or why she chose to hide it. The show treats Camilla's death as a human moment rather than an investigative one, which is the right choice dramatically. but it also means that one more witness to the real origin story exits the narrative without being fully examined. The Matthews conspiracy at its widest isn't about one man's willful blindness. It's about the entire social infrastructure that built itself around Harry's choices, person by person, each one adding another layer of silence and protection until the whole thing had become load-bearing. Take any single piece of it away, and Dexter's secret collapses years earlier. Together they held it for decades. Since we're on the topic of Matthews and knowledge and who was paying attention, it would be a genuine disservice to this video not to spend some proper time on James Doakes. Because Doakes is, I think, the most complicated and most underappreciated character in the entire series. And the reason for that is simple. He was right, not approximately right. Not right in the wrong way or right for the wrong reasons. Completely, precisely, 100% correct. From his very first scene with Dexter to the cabin in the Everglades, Doakes never once misread the situation. He identified Dexter as something dangerous, something wrong, something that didn't belong in a police station or a family home or the civilized world. And he was right every single time. The show frames Doakes as an antagonist, a legitimate source of tension for Dexter, yes, but fundamentally a problem to be managed. He's aggressive, confrontational, and abrasive in ways the show invites you to find exhausting. Dexter finds him exhausting. The audience is positioned alongside Dexter, so we find him exhausting too. He's the obstacle, the threat, the dog that won't stop barking. Except the dog is barking at an actual intruder. The dog is correct. Let me back up to the first episode, because the dynamic between Dexter and Doakes is established with real precision right from the start. Dexter is walking through Miami Metro, smiling, charming, carrying donuts, being every inch the affable, forensic nerd his colleagues expect. And Doakes watches him, doesn't smile back, doesn't accept the performance, just watches with that particular expression that hovers somewhere between hostility and recognition. Dexter's internal monologue in the very first episode asks why, in a building full of detectives trained to read people, Doakes is the only one who makes him uneasy. And the show gives you the answer across the full run of the series, because Doakes has the specific frame of reference to perceive what Dexter is. Doakes was special forces. He operated in places where the rules of engagement were, to put it diplomatically, elastic. He has more officer-related shootings on his record than anyone else at Miami Metro. He knows what it looks like when someone has killed and when the killing didn't cost them what it should. He knows the shape of it. And when he looks at Dexter Morgan, who is smiling and cheerful and impeccably controlled, he sees the shape. He doesn't have the details, but he has the shape. That's not paranoia. That's recognition. And here's what I find genuinely moving about Doakes on rewatch. He can't make anyone else see it. He tries. He tells people Dexter is wrong. He tells them something is off. And everyone, colleagues, superiors, eventually the entire institutional apparatus of Miami Metro, dismisses him as having a personal grudge, a personality conflict, a tendency toward aggression that's coloring his judgment. LaGuerta, of all people, is the one who repeatedly shuts him down on this. The irony of that will come back to us in a later section. Doakes tracks Dexter. He follows him. He puts a GPS tracker on Dexter's boat, which is, in retrospect, an extraordinarily good piece of detective work. He catches Dexter red-handed at the cabin in the Everglades, standing over Jose Garza's body, with Garza's remains partway through disposal. He has him. He has Dexter Morgan cornered, caught, definitively identified as the Bay Harbor butcher. And then Dexter knocks him out with a sleeper hold and puts him in a cage. The cabin scenes that follow are some of the stranger moral sequences in the series, and I mean that as a compliment. Doakes is imprisoned. Dexter's considering whether to kill him. And across several scenes, the two of them talk. Really talk. The conversation is remarkable because Doakes, caged at the mercy of the man he's been right about all along, keeps refusing to stop being right. He says Dexter has a conscience. He says Dexter can't kill him because there's something in him that won't allow it. He keeps treating Dexter as a human being with moral agency rather than as a monster who simply needs destroying. That's a generous read from a man who is locked in a cage by someone who's about to frame him for multiple murders. Doakes dies in the season 2 finale because Lila, who is simultaneously one of the most destructive characters and the show's most convenient plot device, steals Dexter's GPS, finds the cabin, learns the truth about Doakes' imprisonment, decides that Dexter is her soulmate and therefore must be protected, and blows the cabin up with Doakes inside. He dies framed as the Bay Harbor Butcher. His legacy, his record, his career, all of it is destroyed. The case is closed. The real killer walks free. The show treats this as a narrow escape for Dexter, and narratively it is. But step outside Dexter's perspective for a moment, and what you have is a decorated police sergeant who correctly identified a serial killer, gathered enough evidence to make a case, was imprisoned and tortured for it, and then murdered, with his reputation systematically dismantled after his death to ensure the real killer's safety. Doakes never got to be right out loud. He was right in the dark, alone in a cage. And then he was dead. The show later gives Doakes a kind of retroactive acknowledgement when LaGuerta begins her own investigation into whether he was truly the Butcher. LaGuerta, of all the characters in the series, is the one who most faithfully continues Doakes' mission. And what happens to her, we'll talk about in a moment. There's a reason surprise motherfucker became a meme. It's the most Doakes thing imaginable. The triumphant moment of a man who is right finally getting to say so briefly before everything goes wrong again. People have it on t-shirts, people quote it fondly. And the actual Doakes, the one who was correct from episode 1 and spent 2 seasons being correct and dying for it, has never quite gotten the credit the character deserves. He was the moral hero of the piece. He just never got to be in the right story for anyone to notice. Before we move on to the next thread, which is in many ways the direct continuation of what we've been talking about with Doakes, if you're enjoying this kind of long-form exploration and you want to see more of it, subscribing down below is a genuinely easy way to help. These videos take a while to put together, and it always means something when people find them useful. But no pressure at all. On we go. Something about Doakes' history that the show provides but doesn't dwell on is worth pulling out here. His Special Forces background. Doakes served in Army Special Forces before becoming a cop, and the show makes clear that his time in that service was not uncomplicated. He conducted operations in locations and under conditions where the rules governing the use of force were, to put it charitably, flexible. He killed people as a soldier in ways that occupied a gray space between sanctioned military action and something considerably murkier. The show uses this to draw a parallel between Doakes and Dexter. Both are men who have killed in ways that exist outside conventional moral accounting. Dexter even weaponizes this in the cabin when he argues to the imprisoned Doakes that the difference between them is less than Doakes would like to believe. He has more officer-related shootings than anyone else at Miami Metro. He knows what violence feels like from the inside, but the parallel is also what gives Doakes his unique perception. He doesn't have a theory about Dexter. He doesn't build a case from evidence in the early seasons. He has a feeling, and the feeling is rooted in his own experience of what violence does to a person. When Doakes looks at Dexter and feels something wrong, he's responding to a signal that he can recognize because he's been near it himself. He's not detecting a monster, he's detecting a version of something he knows. That's what makes Doakes' death so specifically awful within the moral universe of the show. He's not killed by Dexter, he's killed by Lila, a character whose primary function in Season 2 is to create maximum chaos and then be dispatched in Paris. Doakes dies because a woman with no involvement in his investigation, who found the cabin through Dexter's own GPS device, which he had left accessible, decided to protect the man she'd decided was her soulmate. It's not even a narratively earned death. It's a tidying up. The show needed Doakes gone because keeping him alive would have required the series to actually confront the question of what happens when the person who's right about Dexter is right in a way that can't be managed. The answer the show gave was he dies in an explosion, framed as a suicide, and nobody looks too hard at the inconsistencies, which is, in retrospect, a fairly perfect encapsulation of how the entire institutional machinery around Dexter actually functioned for 8 years. Let me spend a moment on what justice would have looked like if Doakes had succeeded, because I think it's worth imagining the alternative just briefly, not to criticize the show for not going there, but to understand what the show was protecting against by not going there. If Doakes had made it out of the cabin with his evidence intact, the case against Dexter as the Bay Harbor butcher would have been real, if circumstantial. Dexter's boat, his history, his access to police databases, his forensic expertise, all of this would have been in play. Doakes' testimony, though coming from a man on the run from a murder accusation, would have had at least some investigative weight when combined with physical evidence. It wouldn't have been an open and shut prosecution, but it would have been something a determined investigator could work with. And the investigation would have uncovered more than Doakes knew. It would have found the blood slides. It would have traced the victims. It would have eventually led to Harry's role in the code, to Matthew's burial of the suicide report, to Camilla and what she knew, to the whole infrastructure of cover and silence that surrounded Dexter's double life. The show didn't go there, partly for narrative reasons. That story ends the show, and the show wanted to continue. But also, I think, because the show was genuinely interested in a different question. Not what happens when Dexter gets caught, but what does it cost the world that he doesn't? That cost, as we've been discussing all evening, is Doakes' life and reputation, LaGuerta's life, and ultimately Deborah's moral identity. The show totals those costs and lets the audience carry them. What it doesn't do is provide an account. It presents the evidence of what Dexter's freedom costs without delivering a verdict on whether the cost was worth it. That's the Doakes conspiracy at its broadest, not the specific question of who was right, but the larger question of what it means that being right wasn't enough. And that brings us naturally to Maria LaGuerta. LaGuerta is a complicated character to talk about because the show's relationship with her shifts considerably across the seasons. She's not straightforwardly sympathetic in the early years. She's politically ambitious, occasionally ruthless in her career maneuvering and her relationship with Doakes, which she consistently prioritizes over institutional protocol. Gets her into trouble more than once. She's not presented as a moral exemplar. But what LaGuerta is, throughout the run of the show, is competent. She's a good detective, she has good instincts, she reads situations accurately, and in seasons 7 and 8, when she begins quietly investigating whether James Doakes was actually the Bay Harbor butcher, she demonstrates exactly the kind of patient, evidence-based detective work that the show has spent years suggesting Miami Metro is constitutionally incapable of. Here's how it starts. At the church where Dexter kills Travis Marshall, the season 6 finale, LaGuerta finds a blood slide, a single blood slide at the scene of a kill. The Bay Harbor butcher was known to take blood slides from his victims, but this was never released to the public. The butcher's specific trophy method was kept confidential. So if a blood slide appears at the church, it was either left there by the real Bay Harbor butcher or by a copycat who somehow had access to confidential information. Neither explanation fits Doakes being dead. LaGuerta keeps the slide and begins investigating quietly. What follows is probably the best detective arc in the entire series, and it happens to star the character the show had previously coded as an obstacle. LaGuerta works the case methodically. She looks at the evidence, she cross-references. She identifies that Doakes had a solid alibi for one of the confirmed butcher kills during the original investigation. An alibi she remembers because she was there. She traces the cabin where Doakes died back to a man named Santos Jimenez, who was one of the men who murdered Dexter's biological mother, and notes the improbability of that connection being coincidental. She assembles, piece by piece, a circumstantial case pointing at Dexter Morgan. And the case is good. It's not airtight, but it's real. It's the product of genuine investigative work, the kind of thing that would absolutely warrant further inquiry in any functioning institution. The institutional response is to shut her down. Matthews is dismissive. He frames her concerns as the product of lingering grief over Doakes, of loyalty clouding her judgment. He treats her as someone pursuing a personal mission rather than a legitimate investigation. Deborah, now aware of Dexter's secret, having been brought into his confidence in Season 6, actively feeds LaGuerta misinformation and runs interference wherever possible. Quinn gets pulled into the orbit of it. LaGuerta is working against a system that is, at every level, protecting the man she's trying to expose. Not through a formal conspiracy where nobody sits in a room and decides to cover for Dexter, but through the accumulated weight of personal loyalty, self-interest, and the human instinct to protect someone you care about. And the thing is, she's right. Every deduction she makes is correct. Every connection she draws is real. By the Season 7 finale, she has Dexter at a crime scene with enough to arrest him. She has done everything a detective is supposed to do. She has followed the evidence where it leads without letting her conclusions get ahead of her. The Season 7 finale is called Surprise, Motherfucker, which is, among other things, a nod to Doakes. And it's in that finale that LaGuerta dies. Deborah arrives at the scene. LaGuerta has Dexter. Deborah has a gun. And in the most morally catastrophic moment of the original series, Deborah shoots LaGuerta to protect her brother. The show treats this as tragedy, which it is, but it's also something more specific. It's the show killing the only functioning detective the series produced at the moment she was about to succeed at the hands of someone whose moral corruption is directly traceable to Dexter's influence. Deborah Morgan is not a villain. She's a person who loved her brother and made an unforgivable choice to protect him. But what she does in that moment is execute an innocent woman who was doing her job correctly. And the show, to its credit, does not let Deborah off the hook for this. Her Season 8 arc is defined by the psychological fallout, but the institutional consequence is almost nil. LaGuerta is gone. The Butcher file stays closed. Matthews accepts the official account. Life at Miami Metro continues. There's a pattern the show establishes through Doakes and LaGuerta that's worth naming directly. In the moral universe of this show, being a good detective and correctly identifying Dexter Morgan as a serial killer is functionally a death sentence. Both of the characters who do this job properly end up dead. Both of them were right. Neither of them was vindicated within the narrative. The show never names this pattern. It never steps back and says, look what the story requires in order to keep going. But the pattern is there, sitting in the text, undeniable. Every time the show needs to reset to allow Dexter's freedom another season, it costs someone their life or their reputation or both. LaGuerta deserved better, so did Doakes, and the show, which clearly knew this, which built both characters with enough depth and accuracy to make the pattern legible, never bothered to deny it. There's a grace note in the LaGuerta story that I want to mention because it speaks to what the show understood about her even when it was using her as an obstacle. In Season 7, LaGuerta finds Doakes' old case files, his personal notes, the things he had written about Dexter over years of frustrated observation. And in reading those files, she encounters the shape of what Doakes had known. She inherits his investigation. She picks up the thread he was never allowed to follow. There's something almost elegiac about that moment on rewatch. Doakes couldn't save himself. But his work survived him. LaGuerta is, in a real sense, finishing what Doakes started, doing for him, posthumously, what the institutional machinery prevented him from doing while he was alive. She's vindicating him, or trying to, that she dies before completing that vindication, and that the vindication remains permanently incomplete, is the show's most honest statement about what justice looks like inside this narrative. It's deferred, it's blocked. It's always just on the edge of arriving and then prevented by someone who loves Dexter more than they love the truth. The show is not, I think, entirely comfortable with this. Season 8 shows Deborah falling apart under the weight of what she did to LaGuerta. It's not treated as a clean trade-off, protecting Dexter at the cost of Maria's life. Deborah Morgan carries that action as a genuine psychological wound through the entire final season, and it contributes directly to the fragility that leads to her own death. The show is saying, this costs something. What Deborah did to LaGuerta broke something in Deborah that couldn't be unbroken. But the institutional consequence is almost nothing. LaGuerta's investigation closes. The file stays shut. Miami Metro carries on. The world outside Deborah's private grief doesn't alter to accommodate the fact that a good detective was murdered because she was doing her job. That's the most unsettling part of the LaGuerta arc. Not that she died, but that nothing changed when she did, except for Deborah. And even then, Dexter walked free. The pattern the show draws with Doakes and LaGuerta is never named, but it's clear enough. The show's premise requires a world in which good detective work leads to death, because the alternative is a world in which the show's protagonist is caught. That's the fundamental conspiracy of Dexter as a narrative. Not anything in the story, but the story's own dependence on a particular kind of systemic failure to keep going. What I want to add to the LaGuerta thread is something about Deborah, because Deborah's arc after the shooting is, in its own way, the show's most honest engagement with the cost of what it's been asking its audience to accept. Deborah Morgan crosses a line in the season 7 finale that the show treats with appropriate gravity. She shoots an innocent woman. She does it to protect her brother. And season 8, which has its considerable problems, as we'll discuss, gets Deborah's psychological response to this largely right. She doesn't recover. She self-destructs. She drinks. She isolates. She takes a job that puts her in proximity to more violence. The woman who was, in the first few seasons, one of the most vigorously alive characters in the show, driven, funny, emotionally chaotic, but fundamentally decent, becomes someone who can barely hold herself together. The show is saying this cost her, not in the narrative sense of consequence and punishment, in the psychological sense of damage. What Deborah did broke something in her that the story doesn't let her recover from. Her death in the season 8 finale, following the brain surgeon's attack, has a quality of exhaustion to it, as though the show is acknowledging that there was no surviving what she became in order to keep Dexter free. Deborah Morgan is, in a sense, the show's purest expression of the LaGuerta conspiracy's cost. LaGuerta is the one who dies at the scene, but Deborah is the one who has to carry it, and the carrying destroys her just as certainly, just more slowly. What the show never quite manages in the aftermath of all this is a proper accounting. Dexter grieves Deborah. His grief reads as genuine and costs him something real. But the structural injustice, that LaGuerta was right, that Doakes was right, that Deborah became collateral damage in the project of keeping Dexter free, that none of these people get vindication within the narrative, that accounting never arrives. The show gives you the emotional weight without the moral resolution, which is, in the end, a choice, and a choice the show made consistently across every season until New Blood finally had to try to settle the debt. Now let me spend some time on the code itself, because I think the code is the most philosophically interesting element of the whole show and the one that gets the least rigorous examination. The Code of Harry, as presented in the early seasons, is relatively simple in its outline. Dexter may only kill murderers. They must be guilty beyond reasonable doubt. They must have escaped conventional justice, and Dexter must never be caught. Two primary rules, essentially: kill the right people and stay free. The show frames the code as Harry's gift to Dexter, a way of living with what Dexter is. A moral framework that channels dangerous impulses into something that at least approximates a social good. It's the thing that separates Dexter from the killers he hunts. They kill without rules, without standards, without restraint. Dexter kills with all three. The code is what makes him something other than simply a monster. This framing is emotionally persuasive. Across the first few seasons, the code functions as the show's ethical spine. When Dexter follows it, the narrative validates him. When he considers breaking it, the narrative introduces consequences. Season 3, where his friendship with Miguel Prado leads him toward letting someone else operate outside the code, ends with that friendship becoming a threat that Dexter has to neutralize precisely because Miguel's version of vigilante justice has no standards. The code matters, it does something. But then Season 8 arrives, and with it, Dr. Evelyn Vogel. Vogel reveals that she was Harry's collaborator in designing the code. She's a neuropsychiatrist who specialized in what she called the psychopath community. High-functioning individuals who lack conventional empathy but operate within society without detection. She wrote academic papers on them. She considered them, in her more candid moments, something close to a natural variation rather than a pathology. Harry came to Vogel with a problem. A child with an overwhelming compulsion to kill who was going to become either a tool or a catastrophe. Vogel helped him build a system. The code is not a father's improvised love. It is, at least in part, a clinical management protocol designed by a professional who had her own intellectual investment in the outcome. This changes the code's meaning retroactively. If it was designed by a specialist with expertise in high-functioning psychopathy, then the question of whose interests it primarily serves becomes worth examining. Dexter's interests, as a person trying to live without being institutionalized or executed? Yes, clearly, Harry's interests, as a man trying to manage the consequence of his own choices? Also, yes, plausibly. Vogel's interests, as a researcher with a living case study that she had helped create and was now free to observe? This the show raises and then backs away from, but it raises it. What the code doesn't obviously serve, if you look at it carefully, is a clean ethical framework, because the code, as Dexter actually practices it, is not stable. He kills Oscar Prado by accident in Season 3, and then improvises around it. He kills Miguel Prado for personal reasons that have as much to do with betrayal and ego as with the code's standards. He lets Arthur Mitchell live far longer than the code should have permitted because he wanted to learn from him. And that delay cost Rita her life. He kills people with varying degrees of due diligence on the guilty beyond reasonable doubt standard. He develops personal relationships that influence his targeting. By Season 8, the code is barely recognizable as the thing Harry and Vogel designed. I've always thought the most honest way to read the code is as a story. Not a lie exactly, but a narrative. One that Dexter tells himself, that Harry and Vogel helped him construct, that allows him to be a serial killer with self-respect. It gives him identity, purpose, a sense of being different from the monsters he kills. Whether that sense of difference is real is something the show spends 8 seasons exploring without ever quite answering. And here's the thing about stories, they're useful even when they're not entirely true. Dexter's code, even imperfectly applied, probably does produce a net social good. The people he kills are almost all of the time people who deserve to be removed from society. The code's effect, whatever its origin and whatever its inconsistencies, is largely the one Harry intended. The mechanism is messy, but the output is defensible. But the code as the show presents it, the thing Dexter treats as sacred, as the foundational principle of his identity, as the thing that makes him something other than a simple murderer. That's more fragile than the show's first few seasons suggest. It's a management system. It's a cage. It's something designed by other people to keep Dexter functional and hidden. And the fact that Dexter has internalized it as a genuine moral belief doesn't change where it came from. Vogel calls Dexter her masterpiece. The code is her design. The thing Dexter is most proud of, the thing that gives him the right to consider himself something other than a monster, is a product. It was built for him. And the show, to its enormous credit, makes this visible without ever quite making it explicit. It never bothers to deny that the code is, on some level, less Dexter's moral achievement than it is evidence of how thoroughly he was shaped by others. let me talk about a few of the specific moments where the code cracks because I think they're illuminating. Season 3 is the one most explicitly about the code's limits. Miguel Prado, an ambitious assistant district attorney, a man with genuine charisma and access, learns Dexter's secret and wants in. He wants to be a partner in the code. And Dexter, who has spent years operating alone, is seduced by the idea. Here is someone who understands him. Here is someone who shares the logic or seems to. They begin working together. The problem, which the season develops with real care, is that Miguel's version of the code has no standards. He uses Dexter's permission structure, kill the guilty, serve justice, to justify killing people who have crossed him personally, people who are inconvenient rather than dangerous, people the code was specifically designed to exclude. He takes the framework and strips out the ethics, leaving just the violence and the self-justification. Dexter kills him in the end, and the code is restored. But the Season 3 arc reveals something important. The code only works as a moral restraint if the person applying it is genuinely committed to its standards. As a framework, it's entirely portable and entirely corruptible. Anyone could use Dexter's logic to justify almost anything. The difference between Dexter and Miguel is not the framework, it's the application. And that means the code's moral weight depends entirely on Dexter's ongoing commitment to it, which is itself not guaranteed and not fixed. Then there's Season 4 and Rita's death. Dexter had multiple opportunities to kill Arthur Mitchell earlier in the season. He chose not to. He was curious about Trinity, about how a serial killer maintained a family, about what that balance looked like from the inside, about what he might learn from observing it. He let Trinity live to study him, and Trinity killed Rita. This is the code's most catastrophic failure, and it's a failure caused not by external pressure, but by Dexter's own priorities. He put his curiosity, his personal, self-serving interest in understanding Arthur Mitchell, above the code's directive to eliminate a confirmed killer immediately. He broke the code's logic for himself, not for someone else, and the cost was his wife's life. The show treats this as tragedy. It earns its tragedy. But it also reveals that the code, when it interferes with something Dexter wants, is not the absolute it presents itself as. It bends. It accommodates. It prioritizes Dexter's interests even when those interests conflict with its stated purpose. By Season 8, the code is barely the same thing it was in Season 1. It has been revised, compromised, set aside, reinstated, and philosophically challenged so many times that what Dexter calls the code in the final season is less a coherent framework than a habit of reference. He invokes it. He doesn't always follow it. And the show, which was built on the code's integrity, has long since stopped pretending that the integrity is clean. Here's what I find genuinely interesting about the code's trajectory across the full run of the show. It tracks quite accurately the way that moral frameworks typically work when applied to real human lives over long periods. The code is rigid in theory and flexible in practice. It accommodates the things Dexter wants to accommodate. It resists the things he's already resisting. Its standards shift with his needs. This isn't hypocrisy exactly. Or it's not only hypocrisy, it's the natural behavior of any ethical framework applied by a fallible person in complex, changing circumstances. Real moral systems, real codes of conduct, real personal ethics all do this. They start as clear principles and end as negotiated compromises. The Code of Harry is, in this sense, completely realistic. It starts with clean rules and ends as a rationalization structure. A tool for explaining why whatever Dexter has already decided is compatible with who he believes himself to be. The conspiracy the code section of this video has been building toward is, in some ways, the simplest one. The code never guaranteed that Dexter would only kill people who deserved to die. It guaranteed that Dexter would always believe, at the moment of the kill, that his target deserved it. That's a meaningful distinction. Belief and truth are not the same thing. A framework for generating belief can produce conviction without producing accuracy. There are moments in the show where this distinction matters very concretely. Oscar Prado is the most obvious. Dexter kills him, then discovers he wasn't the target. The code can't retroactively make that kill justified. Dexter moves past it quickly. The show lets him. But the crack in the framework is visible if you look at it directly. The code conspiracy, stated plainly, the thing that makes Dexter sympathetic, his framework, his standards, his refusal to be like the killers he hunts, is real enough to shape his behavior, but not rigorous enough to guarantee the outcomes it promises. It's a story he tells about himself that's mostly true and occasionally wrong. And the show, to its credit, builds the evidence for the occasional wrongness into the narrative without forcing Dexter to fully confront it, which is itself the most human thing about him. There's a moment in the season 4 finale that I want to talk about because I think it might be the single most loaded image in the entire series. Dexter comes home to find Rita dead in the bathtub. It's the Trinity killer's work. Arthur Mitchell got there first while Dexter was busy finally catching him. And in one of the most devastating pieces of narrative irony the show ever produced, the man whose delay Dexter had himself caused resulted in the death of his own wife. But it's not Rita's death that's the image I'm thinking of. It's what's next to her. Harrison, their infant son, sitting on the bathroom floor in a pool of his mother's blood, wailing. If you've watched the show from the beginning, you know exactly what you're looking at. This is a deliberate, precise recreation of the shipping container. A small boy in his mother's blood. The camera makes sure you understand the reference. Dexter understands it. It's the moment he picks Harrison up and realizes he's looking at his own origin. And his internal monologue in that moment is something like, Harry was right. He can't change what he is. The show plants this image and then spends years developing its consequences. What does it mean that Harrison's beginning mirrors Dexter's so exactly? Is this the show saying the cycle will continue? Is it a statement about trauma and inheritance? Is it a warning or an inevitability? Seasons 5 through 8 of the original run don't answer this. Harrison is a toddler, then a small child. He's present in scenes, but not developed as a character with interiority. The show keeps the question open without actively engaging with it. And then New Blood arrives, roughly a decade after the original finale, and Harrison is a teenager. He's tracked down his father, who has been living under an alias in Iron Lake, New York, having abandoned Harrison at the end of season 8 to protect him from the reality of what Dexter is. The show that New Blood builds around Harrison's character is, and I say this with genuine appreciation, the most honest engagement the franchise ever makes with its own central premise. Because Harrison has rage, he hurts himself. He has violent impulses that he describes in language that sounds very much like what Dexter calls the dark passenger. He is, in some ways, recognizably his father's son. But here's the question that New Blood sits with. Is that because of genetics, because of the trauma of what happened to him as an infant, or because of the years he spent abandoned by a father who chose self-imposed exile over parenting? The nature versus nurture problem applied to the most extreme possible case. The show's implicit answer, and I think it is genuinely thoughtful, is that it's probably all three, and that the important thing is not the origin of the impulse, but what you do with it. Harrison's arc in New Blood is about whether someone with Dexter's inheritance can choose differently, whether the cycle has to continue or whether there's a place where it can stop. But here's the conspiracy the original show planted and never addressed. Dexter's decision at the end of season 8 to abandon Harrison and fake his death may have done precisely what Harry's decision to leave Brian Moser behind in the container did. He left a traumatized child without the intervention that might have shaped him. Harry's choice produced Brian. Dexter's choice produced, well, a Harrison we'd have to wait 8 years to meet. The parallel is almost too neat. Harry left Brian because he didn't choose him. Dexter left Harrison because he thought he was protecting him. Both men told themselves it was the right call. Both men left a boy behind in the wreckage, and both boys grew up carrying something dark that needed managing. The difference in New Blood is that Harrison manages to choose. He shoots Dexter at the end of the series, with Dexter's own consent, Dexter directing his son to pull the trigger. And in that act, the show suggests the cycle breaks. Harrison makes the hardest possible choice and walks away from Iron Lake as something other than what his father was. Whether you find that ending satisfying depends partly on what you think the show was really about. But there's a version of the Harrison story that reads as the most coherent thematic statement the franchise ever made. The cycle of violence and trauma is not destiny, but it requires active, costly intervention to stop. Both Dexter and Harry thought they could manage it without that cost. Harrison, in the end, accepted the cost. Whether he was right is another question entirely. And then Resurrection reveals Dexter survived. So, I'm not going to render a verdict on Resurrection in this video because the show was still running as of early 2026, and anything I say would be provisional at best. But I want to say something about what Harrison's story means, regardless of how the franchise continues. The Harrison arc in New Blood is doing something quite specific. It's taking the show's central question, nature versus nurture, trauma versus choice. Is Dexter a product of circumstance or of will? And testing it one generation down. Harrison has the genetics. He has the origin trauma. He has the absent father and the absent mother and the years of instability. He has, by the logic of the show's own mythology, every reason to become what Dexter became. And in New Blood's finale, he doesn't. He makes the hardest possible choice and drives away towards some kind of future that the show leaves entirely open. It's not a triumphant ending. It's a devastating one, but it's also the show's clearest statement that the cycle is not predetermined, that the inheritance of violence can be interrupted. The reason that matters here is that it retroactively frames everything about Harrison's first appearance in that bathtub as a question rather than a prediction. The show showed you a baby in blood and asked, is this how it starts again? And the answer eventually was, it depends, on choices, on help, on whether anyone shows up this time rather than leaving a child alone. Harry didn't show up for Brian. Dexter didn't show up for Harrison in the way that mattered. Not occasional visits, not emotional availability, but the actual being there, the consistency, the choice to stay rather than exile himself to a forest. New Blood is partly about whether that absence can be survived, and his answer is carefully equivocal. Maybe at enormous cost, if the person is strong enough and makes the right call when it counts. Let me also note something about the specific mirroring the show employs between Dexter's origin and Harrison's, because I think the precision of it is worth acknowledging. The show is not being subtle. Dexter in blood, mother dead, 2 days alone. Harrison in blood, mother dead, found by his father. The repetition is architectural. It's building a statement about inheritance and pattern, and whether repetition is destiny. The show's final answer, via Harrison, seems to be, not necessarily, but it was willing to let you believe otherwise for a very long time, and the uncertainty served the story rather than undermining it. There's one more dimension to the Harrison story that I want to name before we move on. And it's the one that connects most directly to the Harry conspiracy we started with. Harry, in building the code, believed he was preventing the cycle from producing another uncontrolled killer. He succeeded in Dexter's case. Dexter became something directed rather than chaotic. But the code didn't stop the cycle. It managed one expression of it while leaving the others free. Dexter's management of his own violence didn't make the world around him safer for the people who loved him. Rita died. Deborah died. Harrison was shaped by the same origin trauma that shaped Dexter. The code, whatever it did for Dexter specifically, didn't stop the damage from spreading outward. It contained one thing and let the pressure find other release points. Harry thought the code was the solution. What it was, in practice, was a channel. And channels don't eliminate what flows through them, they just direct it. The damage was always going to go somewhere. Harry's choice determined that it would go somewhere other than the obvious immediate direction, but it didn't determine that it would stop. That's the Harrison conspiracy, and it's the one that threads through the entire franchise. The code doesn't protect the people around Dexter, it protects Dexter. Everyone else is downstream. I think we have to talk about the ending. Not at length, not with bitterness. This isn't the kind of video for either of those things. But the Season 8 finale is one of those creative decisions so specific in its failure that not addressing it in a video like this would be a strange omission. Remember the Monsters aired on September 22nd, 2013. It is, depending on which rating aggregator you consult, one of the lowest rated series finales in the history of prestige television. The IMDb score sits somewhere around 4.6 to 4.9 out of 10. It's frequently included in worst TV endings discussions alongside True Blood, Roseanne, and Lost, though in those discussions it often places higher than its company might suggest because the gap between the promise of earlier seasons and the reality of how it ended is so extreme. What happens in the finale is this. Dexter fakes his own death by driving his boat into a hurricane. After the storm, he is revealed alive, living under an assumed identity in what appears to be a remote forested region of the American Northwest. He's working as a lumberjack. The final shot is Dexter, beard grown out, staring blankly into the camera from inside a wood cabin. He has abandoned his son Harrison to flee to Argentina with Hannah McKay. He has chosen self-exile over everything the show established as mattering to him. The lumberjack problem isn't primarily an aesthetic complaint, though the image is certainly striking in the wrong way. The lumberjack problem is a character logic problem. 8 seasons of Dexter established a person defined by connection, by his relationship to Miami, to his work, to Deborah, to Harrison, to the code, to his identity as a killer. The finale asks us to believe that this person's response to losing Deborah, his sister, the person he loved most, is to abandon his son and go live alone in a forest. It's not that Dexter couldn't reasonably fall apart after Deborah's death. That's plausible. It's that the specific shape of the falling apart, the boat, the hurricane, the complete withdrawal from everyone and everything, contradicts every established beat of his character without offering enough psychological scaffolding to make it coherent. The fan theory that circulated for years afterward, that the intended finale involved Dexter dying and that the network or the showrunners changed course at the last moment, was never confirmed or denied by anyone with definitive knowledge of what happened in the writer's room. The show's creators made varying statements over the years, none of which fully addressed the question of whether an alternative ending existed. Whether by design or by accident, the franchise never provided a clean account of how Remember the Monsters became the episode it was. What it did eventually was make New Blood. New Blood is, in significant part, a correction. It exists because the original finale was not satisfying, which is a remarkable thing for a franchise to implicitly acknowledge through the commissioning of a sequel. The New Blood finale, Harrison shooting Dexter in the heart, Dexter dying in the snow, is the ending the original series was building toward. It addresses the abandonment of Harrison. It forces the confrontation the original series avoided. It gives the cycle of violence theme a coherent resolution. And then Resurrection begins, which reveals that Dexter survived the gunshot, was resuscitated, and is now alive again in New York. I'm not going to render a verdict on Resurrection because the show was still running as of early 2026, and it wouldn't be fair. But the decision to undo the New Blood finale, to bring Dexter back from a death that his son delivered and that the story had been building to, is a decision worth sitting with. The franchise had finally given the character an earned ending, and then it brought him back. The conspiracy that lives inside all of this, the one the show never bothered to deny, is simply that the writers of Dexter, across the full run of the franchise, were never quite willing to follow their own premise to its logical conclusion. The show built a system that demanded a specific kind of reckoning, and at every turn when the reckoning was due, the narrative found a way to delay it or avoid it or undo it. Season 8, the Lumberjack ending. New Blood's correction, and then Resurrection's revision of the correction. The story the franchise seems most interested in telling is one where Dexter keeps going. The story the show's own logic demanded was one where he eventually stops. Those two things have been in tension since 2013, and they're still in tension now. The Lumberjack problem deserves a closer look, because I think it's worth understanding exactly why the character logic fails, not just that it fails. 8 seasons of Dexter establish certain things about who he is. He is someone who functions through structure and ritual, the code, the research, the kill room, the routine of Miami Metro. He is someone who, however imperfectly, forms genuine attachments. He loved Deborah, he loved Harrison. He felt something real about Rita, whatever the show's complicated relationship with that marriage looked like. And crucially, he is someone whose identity is inseparable from Miami, from the place, from the job, from the community of people who know him as Dexter Morgan. The finale asks you to believe that grief after Deborah's death would cause this specific character to abandon all of that and become a silent man in a forest. The grief part tracks. The specific expression of it doesn't. Dexter's response to loss throughout the show has always been to go deeper into the things that ground him, into the code, into work, into the rituals of ordinary life. He retreats into structure. He doesn't flee from it. The Lumberjack Dexter has no structure, no ritual, no community, no purpose. He's sitting in a cabin being blank, which is so radically unlike the Dexter the show spent 8 years building that it almost functions as a different character wearing his face. One more thing about the finale, which connects back to the Harrison thread. The show had already established the perfect structural ending for the original series and then chose not to use it. The ending where Dexter's secret comes fully undone, where the consequences arrive fully formed, where Harrison and Deborah and Miami Metro all have to reckon with what Dexter actually is. That's the ending 8 seasons were building toward. New Blood eventually delivered a version of it. The original series flinched at the last moment and put a lumberjack in its place. Why? We don't know with certainty, and the franchise never clarified. That's the last, cleanest expression of the conspiracy the show never bothered to deny, the one about its own ending. Let me spend a moment thinking about what the show's own logic demanded as an ending, because I think it's clarifying. The show's central arc, followed honestly, builds toward a reckoning. Dexter Morgan is a person who kills people, who is loved by people who don't fully know what he is, and whose secret existence costs the people around him catastrophically. The logic of that arc has one natural endpoint. The people around him eventually understand what he is. The cost becomes fully visible, and there is a reckoning with what that means. Either Dexter faces the consequences, or he faces someone who forces the consequences on him. New Blood gets closer to this than the original finale by a considerable margin. Harrison, who is the one person with the most direct stake in understanding what Dexter is, confronts his father with complete knowledge and makes the choice the show's logic has been building toward for years. It's painful. It's earned. It resolves the most important thematic question the show raised, whether the cycle can stop, with an answer that costs something. The original finale avoided this by substituting geographical isolation for confrontation. Instead of someone who knew Dexter fully choosing how to respond to that knowledge, the show gave us Dexter removing himself from the equation entirely. That's not a reckoning. That's a disappearance. And the difference between disappearing and being held accountable is enormous. What's particularly interesting about the lumberjack ending, with some distance, is that it tries to present Dexter's self-imposed exile as a kind of penance. He's not going to Argentina with Hannah. He's not continuing his life. He's choosing isolation as a form of punishment. The show wants credit for the fact that Dexter doesn't get what he wanted. But self-selected punishment is not accountability. It's not justice. It's Dexter, once again, controlling the narrative of what happens to him. Even in the act of apparent self-punishment, he's the one making the decision. That's who Dexter has always been, someone who manages outcomes rather than facing them. The lumberjack ending is the show being too faithful to his character in the wrong direction. New Blood understood this, which is why Harrison is the agent of the ending rather than Dexter himself. Because the reckoning had to come from outside Dexter's control to mean anything at all. Now let me spend a bit of time on Dr. Evelyn Vogel, because I think she's one of the most interesting characters the show ever introduced and one of the most aggressively underused. Vogel arrives in Season 8, the final season of the original run, as a neuropsychiatrist with a direct connection to Harry Morgan. She explains over the course of the season's early episodes that she was Harry's collaborator, that she helped him build the code, that she's been aware of Dexter's existence and his activities for years from a careful professional distance. She calls Dexter her masterpiece. She treats him with something that presents as maternal warmth, though the word masterpiece is doing a lot of work in that sentence that the show never quite unpacks. What Vogel represents when she arrives is a significant retcon of the show's mythology. The code, which has been the moral and narrative center of the show for 7 seasons, is revealed to be a collaborative project. Harry didn't design it alone. He had professional help from a woman with academic expertise in precisely the kind of psychology Dexter represents. Everything Dexter understands about himself, the framework through which he makes sense of the dark passenger and the killings and his own nature, all of that was constructed with Vogel's input. The implications of this extend in 2 directions. The first is what it means for Dexter specifically, that his identity as a person operating under a self-developed ethical code is, to some degree, a fiction. The code wasn't born from Harry's love and desperation. It was designed. The framework Dexter has internalized as his genuine moral compass was built for him by people with their own interest in the outcome. We talked about this in the code section, so I won't go over it again here. The second implication is the one the show barely touches and never resolves. If Vogel helped Harry design the code for Dexter, did she do this for other people? The show raises this obliquely. Vogel's academic work focused on what she called the psychopath community. She had a professional fascination bordering on advocacy for high-functioning psychopathic individuals. She believed they represented a kind of human variation that society had failed to understand. She had clearly more than one patient in her career whose psychology resembled Dexter's. Did she build codes for others? Were there other Dexters, people with similar compulsions, who she helped construct management frameworks for, channeling their violence in one direction or another? The show introduces the brain surgeon subplot in Season 8, which involves Vogel's son Daniel, who is also a killer and who eventually murders his mother. This is the show's gesture toward the idea that Vogel's project doesn't always end well. But Daniel isn't another Dexter. He's a refutation of the project, not an extension of it. The larger question, how many patients did Vogel have? What did she build for them? Where are they now? Is dropped entirely when she's killed 2/3 of the way through Season 8. She dies before the show can do anything serious with what her existence implies. The mythology she represents is introduced and then closed off without being explored. What I find genuinely interesting about Vogel is the question of sincerity. Did she love Dexter in her way, or was she always observing him? Was the warmth genuine, or was it the warmth a researcher develops for a particularly successful study? The show presents both readings simultaneously. There are scenes where Vogel's care for Dexter reads as entirely real. She's frightened for him. She's moved by him. She treats him as something she's genuinely invested in as a person. And there are scenes where the clinical framing bleeds through. The word masterpiece is one. The ease with which she discusses his psychology in abstract terms is another. The fact that she kept detailed records and notes on Dexter for years without his knowledge suggests a professional distance that her maternal effect doesn't fully cover. The show doesn't resolve this. Vogel dies ambiguously warm, and the question of what she actually was to Dexter, person, project, or both, is never settled. What her existence leaves unresolved and what the show never bothered to deny is the suggestion that Dexter's code is not unique, that there may be a Vogel-designed infrastructure operating quietly in other lives, other cities, that the show's singular protagonist may be one expression of a repeatable process, and that the woman most responsible for what Dexter became viewed him, in her more honest moments, as her finest work rather than as her greatest responsibility. The masterpiece doesn't get to choose its artist. That's the Vogel conspiracy, stated plainly, and the show plants it with precision and then walks away. Let me spend a moment on what the brain surgeon subplot does with Vogel's mythology, because it's relevant even though the show handles it imperfectly. The brain surgeon, eventually revealed to be Vogel's son, Daniel Vogel, who she thought was dead, is a killer who leaves victims with portions of their brain removed, leaving them for Vogel specifically. He's trying to reach his mother. He's angry, violent, and targeting the person responsible for his situation. It's not difficult to see the parallel the show is drawing. Daniel Vogel is, in his warped way, doing something structurally similar to what Brian Moser did in Season 1, a person who was failed by a parent, operating in the only register available to them. Trying to make contact through destruction. Brian left bodies for Dexter. Daniel leaves bodies for Vogel. The show keeps returning to this pattern. The terrible thing as communication, the violence as a form of reaching out. And it says something consistent across all its seasons about what happens to people who are formed by damage and then left without adequate response. What the brain surgeon subplot doesn't do is ask the larger question Vogel's existence raises. How many times has she done this? Daniel was damaged partly by her professional choices. The show implies she had him institutionalized as a child when he showed troubling signs, and the institutionalization itself contributed to his development. Dexter was shaped by her code design. Are there others? The show's answer is to kill Vogel before the question can be properly posed. That's frustrating on a narrative level, but it's also honest about something. The show doesn't want to be a story about a network of Vogel-designed psychopaths. It's a story about one man. Broadening the scope would dilute what the show does best. So Vogel is introduced, used to reframe the mythology, and removed before she can complicate things too much. The result is a character who implies far more than the show can accommodate, and who exits leaving the most interesting version of her story untold. Which is, I'd argue, entirely consistent with how the show handles most of its best conspiracies. Plant them carefully, let them grow to a certain height, and then quietly stop watering them. The audience will tend to the rest on their own. There's a question that Vogel's existence raises about the show's ethics, and it's one I find worth sitting with. The show's implicit argument most of the time is that what Dexter does is complicated but not entirely unjustifiable. He kills people who deserve it. He removes threats from society. The code, however imperfectly applied, produces outcomes that are at least defensible. Vogel complicates this by being the person who made that argument systematic. She didn't just help Dexter manage his psychology. She built a philosophical framework for why psychopaths like Dexter serve a social function. Her academic work argued more or less that people without conventional empathy who can be directed towards socially useful ends are not necessarily pathological. They are, in her framing, a kind of specialist, a type of person with different wiring who can do things that other people cannot. This is a seductive argument. It's also a very dangerous one, and the show knows it's dangerous. Because the same argument that justifies the code and celebrates Dexter's usefulness also justifies the institutional tolerance of everything that surrounds him. It's the argument that says, yes, some people will be harmed in the management of this system, but the overall outcome is worth it. The show never explicitly endorses this argument. But it builds it carefully through Vogel, lets it stand long enough to do its work, and then kills Vogel before the argument can be fully interrogated. That's the Vogel conspiracy in its most honest form. The show almost made a philosophical argument for why Dexter's existence is not just tolerable but valuable, and then thought better of it and removed the person making the argument before she could finish. You're left with the half-built case sitting in the ruins of Season 8, incomplete and unrefuted, which is probably exactly where the writers wanted to leave it. So that's what we've covered tonight: Harry's guilt and whether the code was ever really a gift. Brian Moser, left behind in the container while his brother was chosen. The dark passenger and the question of whether it's real or whether it's the story Dexter needed to survive himself. Captain Matthews and the strategic application of not knowing. Doakes, who was right from the first episode and died for it in the dark. LaGuerta, who followed the evidence correctly and was killed at the moment she was about to succeed. The code itself, and whether it was ever really Dexter's or whether it was always someone else's design. Harrison, and whether the cycle could stop. The finale, and what it tells us that the show couldn't quite follow its own logic to its conclusion. And Vogel, who called Dexter her masterpiece and left the question of what that word meant sitting quietly in the air. You'll notice these aren't really separate conspiracies. They're facets of the same one. They're all variations on the same question the show asks from its very first episode and spends 8 seasons and 2 sequels and a prequel, approaching from different angles without ever quite landing on an answer. Is Dexter Morgan responsible for what he is? The show's genius, and I do think it's genius even in the years when the execution didn't always match the ambition, is that it never lets you fully answer yes or no. Yes, because Dexter makes choices. He acts, he decides, he could at any moment stop. No, because Harry shaped him, Vogel designed him, trauma built him, circumstance placed him exactly where his impulses could find the outlet they needed. Yes and no, because both are true simultaneously, in the way that both things are always true of people whose nature and nurture are difficult to separate. The conspiracies the show never bothered to deny are, at their root, the uncomfortable implications of that central ambiguity. If Dexter isn't fully responsible, then Harry is more culpable than the show lets him be. If the code isn't really Dexter's moral achievement, then the vigilante framework that makes us root for him is shakier than we'd like. If Doakes and LaGuerta were right and died for it, then the show we spent years watching is more morally troubling than the fun genre packaging suggested. The show knew all of this. It built all of this in deliberately. And it had the courage most of the time to let those uncomfortable implications sit without resolving them. That's the kind of writing that makes a show worth coming back to, worth rewatching, worth spending a long evening with. The kind where the things left unsaid are as carefully placed as the things that are. There's a thing I believe about stories that Dexter confirms for me, and it's this. The measure of a story isn't whether it answers all its questions, it's whether the questions it leaves open are interesting enough to live inside. The best stories give you a world that extends past the edges of the page, where you can think about what happened before the first scene or after the last one, or sideways into the lives of people who only appeared for a few episodes. Dexter does this consistently, the Harry Morgan that exists in the spaces the show leaves around him, the Brian Moser that might have been, the LaGuerta investigation that almost succeeded. These are not failures of plotting, they're evidence of a fictional world with genuine depth. I'm also aware, after spending this long going through these threads, that none of them are unique to Dexter. Every long-running story about a morally compromised protagonist has versions of these questions. Every show that asks you to root for someone doing terrible things eventually has to either resolve the moral contradiction or decide to live with it permanently. What makes Dexter distinctive is how precisely it planted these contradictions, how much they feel like choices rather than accidents. Harry's suicide isn't just a plot development, it's a statement about the limits of the code mythology. Doakes isn't just an antagonist, he's the show, testing whether its protagonist could survive contact with someone genuinely correctly, right? LaGuerta isn't just a death, she's the show acknowledging what has to be sacrificed to keep Dexter's story going. and the show's willingness to let all of that sit unresolved, to let the implications radiate outward from the text without containing them, is the thing that keeps people like me coming back to it years after the finale aired. Not to find answers, but to keep sitting with the questions in good company. One of the things that makes a show genuinely rewatchable, as opposed to merely enjoyable, is that the second viewing changes the first. When you know what happens to Doakes, your experience of Doakes in season 1 is different. When you know about Harry's suicide, the early flashbacks of Harry as a wise, steady authority figure carry a different weight. When you know that the code was co-designed by a neuropsychiatrist with an academic interest in the outcome, the early scenes of Dexter invoking it with something like reverence become quietly complicated. Dexter is a show that rewards second viewings precisely because of what it doesn't tell you the first time around. The conspiracies we've talked about tonight aren't visible on the surface. They require the kind of sustained, caring attention that you give to something you love. The attention that notices what's present because you're also noticing what's missing. That's not the experience of a casual viewer. That's the experience of a fan who's watched it enough times to know where to look, which is, I suppose, the most optimistic reading of everything we've discussed. The show planted these questions not despite caring about its audience, but because of it. It trusted that the people who loved it would look closely enough to find the uncomfortable implications. And it trusted that they would be able to sit with those implications without needing them resolved. That's a kind of respect for an audience that not every show offers. I want to say one more thing before we close, which is about what it means to love a show like Dexter in the long term. Because I think there's something particular about loving flawed, morally complicated fiction that doesn't get talked about enough. When you love a show that asks you to root for someone doing terrible things, you enter into a kind of ongoing negotiation. You have to keep deciding whether the things the show gives you, the character complexity, the performances, the emotional richness, the genuine insight into human psychology, are worth the things it costs you, the moral compromises. The moments where the show asks you to look away from what it's doing in order to stay with the protagonist. The times when rooting for Dexter requires you to hope, quietly, that Doakes doesn't succeed. That LaGuerta doesn't find what she's looking for. Most of us make that negotiation without quite naming it. We watch, we care, we're invested, and somewhere in the back of the watching, we're also registering the cost. The show is doing something to our instincts, redirecting them, asking us to want things that our ordinary moral sense would resist. That's not manipulation exactly, it's craft. It's the craft of using a character's perspective to show you the world through eyes you'd never choose, and finding, uncomfortably, that you understand what you see. What the conspiracies we've talked about tonight do is surface that cost. They make legible the thing that's been happening quietly under the surface. The show building a world that requires the good detectives to fail, that requires the people who love Dexter to be destroyed by that love, that requires you to keep choosing the protagonist over the truth. The conspiracies are where the show's craft and the show's ethics meet. They're where you can see very clearly what the story required and what it cost. And the fact that the show built them in carefully and deliberately rather than hiding them, the fact that the pattern with Doakes and LaGuerta is legible, that Harry's complexity is visible, that the code's origins are eventually revealed, suggests that the show wasn't comfortable being purely manipulative either. It wanted you to see the cost. It built the evidence in. It trusted you to feel the weight of it, even as it kept you rooting for the man at the center. That's an unusual thing to do, and it's one of the reasons I think that Dexter has lasted. Not just the character, not just the performances, but the moral architecture underneath. The willingness to make the uncomfortable visible, the refusal to fully resolve the contradiction, the insistence that you hold both things at once, the affection and the accounting, and sit with what that feels like, which is, I suppose, exactly the kind of thing to sit with on a quiet evening before sleep. Wherever you are tonight, I hope this was a good evening, whether you've been nodding along and thinking of threads I missed, or drifting in and out and just keeping it company, I'm glad you were here. There's more I'd like to do in this space. The show has enough in it for 100 evenings like this one, and I'm already making notes for the next one. But for now, Dexter can rest. The dark passenger can be quiet for the night. Sleep well.